Greetings and welcome to our discussion on the human heart. We are continuing on with the cardiovascular system, and in this segment we're doing part one of our discussion on the heart. That means we're going to be doing the structure of the heart, and then we're going to be looking at some cardiac muscle fibers. As always, this serves as an accompaniment to the course readings and highlights some of the main ideas of our material. So we've been talking about this system called the cardiovascular system. Last time we talked about blood and how blood is a major component of this cardiovascular system. This blood has all the essential nutrients and gases and proteins that the human body needs, and we circulate that material around the tissue that needs that material. Well, this system must have a pump to deliver this fluid, and that is what the heart is. It is, in a sense, a double pump that is able to accomplish this task. Later on, we talk about the blood vessels of this cardiovascular system. Right now, we go into this human heart. Let's keep in mind the big picture is that the main purpose of the heart is to generate sufficient blood pressure to adequately perfuse the trillions of cells in the human body. And when we say perfuse, we're talking about getting fluids to these cells and tissue. So this heart has a tough job. It's got to propel blood through millions of miles of blood vessels in the human body. And so here we begin on this journey. Students in the medical profession will like to take note of this since heart disease remains the #1 leading cause of death worldwide and in the United States. So let's start by looking at a general heart location, size, and structure. Well, in the lower right-hand corner, we see just sort of a general evolution of hearts. Notice that a primitive creature would be a crocodile, turtles, snakes, and lizards. And in mammals, we have a sort of septum that has caused this to function much more efficiently. So by definition, we might say this heart is a sort of hollow muscular organ, and it's that of vertebrate animals, and its rhythmic contraction acts as a sort of force pump, maintaining the circulation of blood. In a minute, we're going to take a look at where this heart lies in the chest. It's between the lungs, resting on the diaphragm. The size, approximately the size of your fist. And keep in mind that it's not strictly on the left side of the body. It's more of a lined in the center. We're going to go later on more in depth into the pericardium that surrounds this heart. We're going to talk about the heart wall, that is the muscle that makes up the main part of this heart. We discuss in depth some chambers, those 4 chambers, and the 4 valves that run between those chambers. Let's take a closer look at the location of the heart. We see that the heart is located in the mediastinal cavity. The sternum is anterior to this heart, and it obscures it from an anterior view, the more medial portion of the heart. Therefore, around the sides of that sternum, we can see the lateral margins. We see that this lung is this heart is resting between the lungs. In this diagram, notice how they're taking some devices and pulling those lungs to the side. It is actually located smack dab along the midline, and it has a base. The base tends to be superior, and the apex tends to be inferior. So in a sense, it looks like a sort of upside down pyramid. The heart is rotated slightly in the mediastinum. The anterior costal surface is more so on the right side of the heart. We see that this heart is sort of wrapped in a sort of pericardium that protects the heart. Let's take a closer look now at that pericardium. So we take this human heart in the upper left and imagine us zooming in a little bit further into this tissue that surrounds the heart. And we see that the heart is encased in a fibroserous sac, and we call that the pericardium. Its outer fibrous portion is termed the fibrous pericardium, and then the inner serous portion is termed the serous pericardium. Let's jump ahead to the next slide to take a better look at this pericardium. And here we see that this outer pericardium is attached inferiorly to the diaphragm, and superiorly it is attached to the base of the great arterial vessels, that is the pulmonary artery and the aorta. The fibrocerosus sac anchors the heart in the chest so that it does not bounce around when an individual moves, and it also is going to prevent over-distension of the heart due to overfilling. And this can sometimes lead to homeostatic imbalances such as pericarditis. Pericarditis is an inflammation of that pericardium, and this is typically caused by things like viruses, bacteria, or fungi. We also have the condition of a cardiac tamponade. That's going to be a fluid built up inside that pericardial cavity. There's naturally going to be some fluid in there that's going to reduce the friction of that heart beating day in, day out. But once we receive more than 120 cc's of fluid in there, it could possibly stop the beating of that heart. Let's go back now and take a little bit closer look at some of the things besides our pericardium. In the lower left-hand corner, we see a diagram that shows this pericardial layer. Note from this diagram that the heart is not just simply inside a sac. It is in fact surrounded by a double-layered sac. So this inner serous pericardium is a double-layered closed sac that surrounds the heart, and the heart is again surrounded by both layers of that sac. The outermost layer of this serous pericardium is going to be attached to the inner portion of the fibrous pericardium, and we term this the parietal pericardium. Then the innermost layer of the serous pericardium forms the surface of the heart, and we term that the visceral pericardium. Since this layer also forms the surface of the heart, we're going to synonymously call this the epicardium as well. And then there's going to be a space in between here. Between these two layers of the serous membrane, there's a possible space. We're going to call that the pericardial cavity. And that's going to contain that serous, aka watery fluid known as pericardial fluid. This fluid is going to be secreted by the serous membrane layers, and again, that allows a friction-free motion of the heart inside this chest. Deep to this pericardium are going to be layers of the heart wall. Before we jump into those layers, notice on the lower right-hand corner we see sort of cardiac muscle bundles. The McKinley textbook that we sometimes read in the course is going to be also calling this a fibrous skeleton of the heart. And this is going to be composed of dense irregular connective tissue, and that's going to provide both mechanical support and electrical insulation of that heart. So let's look at some layers of this heart. We start where we left off with the pericardium, and that is going to bring us to the epicardium. So we talk about three layers of this heart wall: epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. This epicardium, again earlier we called it the visceral pleura, is composed of single squamous epithelia, and it's overlying a shallow layer of areolar connective tissue. And by the way, as an individual ages, this epicardium thickens as it becomes also more vested with adipose connective tissue. Next, we arrive at the myocardium. This is the main thick part of this heart muscle. This is going to be our middle muscular layer of the heart. it is composed of cardiac muscle. And this is the tissue that's going to provide the main thrust, whether it be taking the blood from one chamber to another chamber, or if it's going to be pushing this blood through the entire systemic circuit. Then our innermost heart wall layer is termed the endocardium. This endocardium is going to be composed of simple squamous epithelia, and once again, it's going to have an underlying areolar connective tissue base. This endothelium of the endocardium is continuous with the endothelium of the blood vessels, these greater vessels that come out of the heart. Let's look at some general gross anatomy of the heart. Here we are looking at a frontal cut made through this human heart. In lab class, we'll be making a similar cut, starting at the apex of the heart. And we can see that there are 4 chambers to this heart. This heart has 2 of those chambers in the superior region are going to be known as the atria. The 2 inferior chambers are going to be known as the ventricles. And so blood enters the heart through the atria and exits the heart through the ventricles. Then we see that this heart can physiologically be divided into 2 sides, and these 2 sides effectively act as 2 separate pumps in the heart, a sort of right-sided pump and a left-sided pump. One's going to be supplying the systemic circuit, and the other's going to be supplying the pulmonary circuit. And then we notice that there's some large blood vessels coming off of these chambers. Let's focus now on this right side of the heart, and keep in mind this is anatomical right. The right side of the heart is going to be composed of the right atrium, and then inferior to that is going to be the right ventricle. This right ventricle pumps blood to the lungs through the pulmonary trunk. You might notice that it's actually split into 2 pulmonary arteries at that point, such that is the right-sided pump. Then now we look at this left side of the heart. On the superior portion of the heart, we see a left atrium, and inferior to that left atrium is going to be a left ventricle. This left ventricle pumps blood to the rest of the body through the main vessel called the aorta. And then blood returning to the heart from the 2 lungs is transported through the pulmonary veins, and those pulmonary veins are going to enter at the left atrium. And then blood returning to the heart from the rest of the body is then transported through the superior vena cava and then also the inferior vena cava. These both dump into the right atrium. So this superior vena cava is going to return blood to the superior region of the heart, where the inferior vena cava is going to return blood from body structures inferior on that lower portion of the atrium. Let's take a look now at some external features of this heart. And as we mentioned earlier, this human heart is composed of 4 chambers, 2 of which are atria and 2 are ventricles. And perhaps you can almost make out the location of those atria and ventricles on an external examination. This one showing a frontal view, this one showing a posterior view. So we arrive at these items called sulci, kind of deep grooves. So the surface of the heart has some very deep grooves. These grooves can serve as external lines of demarcation. They're going to help us sort of delineate the separation of some of those internal structures. And then also we're going to have some blood vessels and some fat running through the sulci. The first major one is the coronary sulcus. So we arrive at that through an anterior view of the surface of the heart. This coronary sulcus is going to externally separate the atria and the ventricles. And this sulcus then travels a sort of circumference around this heart. Next, we notice the placement of an anterior interventricular sulcus. This is going to externally and anteriorly separate the two ventricles. So let's make some sense of that word. Anterior meaning in front, inter meaning between, ventricle meaning between the ventricles, and the sulcus is a sort of groove. So that puts us right here at the anterior interventricular sulcus. And then we have a posterior interventricular sulcus. We can see this on a posterior view of that heart. Again, this is going to be a sulcus that's going to separate the two chambers, the two ventricles of the heart. This diagram is a general sort of break from the diagrams we're showing you. This is an external view of this human heart. And perhaps you can see some of the structures that we talked about in our slides. This image in looker's lower right shows the prominence of the right atrium and the right ventricle when this heart is viewed in this anterior manner. Notice we have these sort of flap-like, sort of wrinkled dog ear appearing structures hanging from the external surface. These are going to be called auricles. So we see there's a right auricle and then there's a left auricle. These are going to be synonymous with the atria of the heart, that is more deep and interior. Furthermore, we perhaps see a nice view of these larger vessels coming off of these chambers. And notice that this yellowish whitish color is suggesting the adipose that covers the outside of this heart. Let's focus now more on some of those chambers of the heart. And you might recall that the two atria of the heart are separated by a thin wall known as the interatrial septum. And let's look at this right atrium now. You can see that this right atrium has a smooth posterior wall, and then it's going to have a ridged anterior wall. And that texture, that ridged texture, is going to be due to pectinate muscles that are located on the interior surface of the right auricle. This right atrium of the adult heart has three openings into it. One is going to be the coronary sinus opening, and this is going to be part of the coronary circulatory system. And that is, it's a vessel that's going to drain blood from the heart wall. And then also it has the two other openings that are going to be coming from the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. In addition, there's a structure called the fossa ovalis. This fossa ovalis is a remnant of a structure called the foramen ovale. That's present in the fetus. This foramen ovale is going to be an opening that allows blood to shunt from the right atrium to the left atrium, thus bypassing the fetal lungs. The idea here is that as a fetus, the lungs do not supply oxygen to the fetus. That oxygen is supplied by the umbilical cord vessels. And we talk about fetal circulation later on, but long story short, this foramen ovale acts as a bypass for the lungs. In this right atrium, we also find a tricuspid valve. That means it's going to have a valve that controls or helps flow of blood flowing from the right atria to the right ventricle. And it gets the name tricuspid valve because it has three cusps, also called leaflets. And this valve allows blood to empty from the right atrium into the right ventricle. Let's now look at that right ventricle we just discussed. We've seen that it forms most of the anterior surface of the heart. Upon a close inspection of this right ventricle, we can see smooth, sort of irregular muscle ridges. We're going to call these trabeculi carinae. These are going to be raised bundles of cardiac muscle. In addition, we have muscular projections that extend from the inferior surface of the right ventricle. We're going to call these papillary muscles. There could be maybe 2 to 9 of these muscles. If we look closely, we see that Anchored down to these papillary muscles are chordae tendineae. These are going to be structures that latch on to the papillary muscles, and these papillary muscles can sort of pull those strings sort of tightly and make sure that there's no sort of beating or flapping around with those delicate valves, those atrioventricular valves. In this diagram, we see a septum that divides left and right ventricles. And also then we see there's going to be a pulmonary semilunar valve. This pulmonary semilunar valve is then going to control blood flow that runs up to the pulmonary circuit. We now arrive at the left atrium. The internal anatomy of this left atrium is kind of similar in many ways to the internal anatomy of that right atrium we just discussed, with the one exception that that structure, the fossa ovalis, cannot be seen in the wall of the left atrium. We see that this forms most of the base of the heart, and it articulates with the pulmonary veins. So that means that it's receiving blood from the lungs. Remember that the word veins refers to blood that's coming towards the heart. So even though this blood is oxygenated, it actually is coming towards the heart, which is a unique feature. We then see that we have a bicuspid valve, and that's going to be covering the opening between the left atrium and the left ventricle. And again, it gets its name bicuspid because it has two cusps. And how might a student perhaps memorize the names of the valves? Try the mnemonic device LAM, perhaps. That might be helpful. And from this left atrium, we then arrive at our left ventricle. Again, this left ventricle is similar in many ways to the internal anatomy of the right ventricle. That is, we're going to have valves, we're going to have trabeculae carnae, we're going to have chordae tendineae, we're going to have papillary muscles. Except there's one unique difference, and that is the wall of the left ventricle is much thicker than that of the right ventricle. And the reason for this is that this left ventricle must push all this blood through the entire systemic circuit of the body. Again, miles and miles of blood vessels, and some of these, the diameter, just fractions of a millimeter. So this left ventricle forms the apex of the heart. And again, that apex of the heart leans to the left side of the heart. That's why we kind of feel a little bit more of a thrust on the left side of our heart. And this ventricle does have a valve. It's an exiting valve. That's the aortic semilunar valve. So this aortic semilunar valve is going to then pass blood up to the ascending aorta. And this ascending aorta is a large blood vessel in the human body. It's a main passageway for oxygenated blood. This diagram simply shows a transverse view of the heart now. This reinforces that idea that this left ventricle has much thicker myocardium than the atrial walls or even the right ventricle. So let's now turn our attention to the pathway of blood through the heart. This diagram is a general overview of two main circuits in the cardiovascular system, the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. As we mentioned earlier, the human heart is a double pump, so to speak. It's going to service both of these circuits. Let's take a look at how this pumps through. We see that we'll start here at the right atrium where we are receiving blood. We're receiving deoxygenated blood, blood that has received waste, blood that has been taken oxygen away from and put in carbon dioxide into. So we need to send this blood up to the pulmonary circuit, up to the lungs. So we go from right atria to right ventricle. A thrust of the right ventricle sends it up through one of the semilunar valves up into the pulmonary arteries. Remember, they're called pulmonary arteries because they're going away from the heart. This is a unique situation where these arteries are actually given a blue color, and they're given a blue color because they are deoxygenated or oxygen poor. Once this blood hits the lungs, we drop off the carbon dioxide and pick up the oxygen. Hence, it's a color change. With a color change, and it's now oxygen rich, it's ready to come back towards the heart. Hence, we call it pulmonary veins. We enter our left atrium. Left atrium goes to left ventricle, and there's that nice thick myocardia that gives us a good strong thrust, sending blood rushing through this semilunar valve up to the aorta, and from the aorta it's going to go through the entire systemic circuit. Things like renal arteries, things like hepatic arteries, etc. We're all going to be dropping off oxygen, nutrients, and gases to the tissue. We're going to perfuse. And then after we've dropped those substances off of the tissues, we then pull that blood back together through venous structures. Again, things like the hepatic portal vein or things like the inferior vena cava come back to this right atrium of the heart. So in summary, that is how the systemic circuit works together with the pulmonary circuit. Now we turn our attention to coronary circulation. In other words, a circulation for the heart itself. I personally think it's interesting that this heart continuously pumps blood through its chambers, but yet it cannot absorb the oxygen and nutrients that it requires from this blood. So this heart needs its own blood supply, and we term this the coronary circulation. This is a very active muscle. This heart muscle needs lots of oxygen. And when the heart relaxes, high pressure blood in the aorta pushes blood into those coronary vessels. And this circulatory pattern of coronary arteries can actually vary greatly among different individuals. These coronary circulation systems have anastomoses. In other words, they are repetitive routes that allow multiple detours or multiple points of access for the blood, ensuring that even though there might be one blockage somewhere, all of the heart tissue is going to receive some form of blood. Let's now turn our attention to coronary arteries. And again, the purpose of these coronary arteries is they're going to nourish the heart with oxygen and nutrients. And we have two main coronary arteries that originate off the ascending aorta, immediately superior to that aortic valve. These are going to be our right and left coronary arteries. And we see that these arteries travel in the coronary sulcus. The right coronary artery typically branches into the right marginal artery to supply the right border of the heart with oxygen. And then there's a posterior interventricular artery to supply the posterior surface of both the right and left ventricles. We see there is a left coronary artery that's going to then branch off into a circumflex artery to supply the left atrium and ventricle with blood. And then we're going to arrive at an anterior interventricular artery. That's going to supply the anterior surface of both ventricles and most of the interventricular septum with blood. Blood flow to these coronary arteries is somewhat intermittent. That is, the arteries are open and blood is flowing when a chamber of the heart is relaxed. But when the chamber is contracted, the arteries supplying the contracted chamber are squeezed shut. And this is since the heart is an intermittent pump. Blood flows intermittently to a chamber, but this intermittent flow is adequate enough for heart wall perfusion. Let's now take a look at coronary veins. These are going to collect wastes from cardiac muscle. and also that means they're going to return venous blood. So this occurs through one of several cardiac veins. We have three main cardiac veins. We have a great cardiac vein, a middle cardiac vein, and a small cardiac vein. What happens then is these all then drain into one large sinus located on the posterior surface of the heart. We're going to call that the coronary sinus. So let's look at this great cardiac vein. We're going to see that the great cardiac vein is located in the anterior interventricular sulcus. And that's going to be positioned right alongside the anterior interventricular artery. Then the middle cardiac vein is located within the posterior interventricular sulcus, and that is positioned right alongside posterior interventricular artery. We can see from this diagram that small cardiac vein travels alongside that of the marginal artery. And again, all of these coronary veins drain into the coronary sinus, which is then going to dump its blood into the right atrium. Let's take a break and turn our attention to some homeostatic imbalances, some coronary circulation problems. One such problem we see is a myocardial infarction, also more commonly known as a heart attack. This is a potentially lethal condition resulting from a sudden or a complete occlusion of a coronary artery, in other words, blockage. What happens then is this, because there's a blockage of the blood vessel, a region of the myocardium becomes deprived of oxygen, and some of this tissue may die, and hence it could be replaced with scar tissue. Some people experiencing a myocardial infarction report a sudden development of excruciating or crushing chest pain. Sometimes they talk about radiating pain in the left arm or the left side of the neck. Blood clots can also be a homeostatic imbalance. Again, if a blood clot breaks loose and it travels throughout the system and it becomes lodged in the heart, that can result in not bringing enough blood to that region. How can we prevent this? We can use certain anticoagulants such as heparin to break the clot out and move it forward. In addition, we can sometimes use a balloon angioplasty, and that's where we're going to put a microscopic balloon inside that blood vessel, so to speak. We're going to expand it, allowing the blood to finally move through. And another myocardial imbalance is angina pectoris. That's going to be heart pain from ischemia of heart muscle. Ischemia would be a sort of swelling that occurs in that cardiac tissue. As a side note, we can sometimes treat these myocardial ischemias and infarction by possibly injecting stem cells into the heart, allowing these stem cells to repopulate and build new healthy cardiac muscle tissue. Another possible remedy for these homeostatic imbalances is a heart transplant. Artificial hearts offer a possible future solution for these homeostatic imbalances. Let's now slow down a little bit and turn our attention towards these heart valves. As we mentioned earlier, we do have 4 valves. 2 of those are being atrioventricular valves, that is the tricuspid and the mitral valve, aka bicuspid valve, and 2 of those are going to be the semilunar valves, that is the pulmonary semilunar valves and the aortic valve. Notice how blood flows through these valves. Keep in mind that these valves are not they do not operate like a gate that opens and closes. These valves are passive functions. In other words, when blood rushes through, the valves simply open up. But then when the heart contracts, the blood kind of snaps back against that valve and forces it shut. So these AV valves open and allow blood to flow into the atria and ventricles when ventricular pressure is lower than atrial pressure. So these semilunar valves are going to open with a ventricular contraction. And again, the valves simply part ways and allow the blood to rush past them. The pulmonic valve is one of these semilunar valves. It has three sort of half-moon pocket-shaped cusps to it. And then these semilunar valves will sort of snap shut when ventricles relax. In other words, we see in the upper right-hand corner, when they relax, the blood kind of puts some back pressure against it. And these valves are going to allow the blood to be contained within the chamber, and it's going to prevent backflow of blood. Here we observe some more homeostatic imbalances of the cardiovascular system. One term is a stenosis. A stenosis is a narrowing of a heart valve, and that's going to restrict blood flow. Perhaps you can observe that in the lower left-hand corner. And then we have the topic of incompetence. That is the failure of a valve to close completely, and that's going to allow some mixing of blood. We can see that in the lower right-hand corner, a little bit of regurgitation of that blood. We can sometimes correct these homeostatic imbalances. The stenosed valves can be repaired by a sort of balloon that we can put in there. We can do surgical repair, or sometimes even replace the entire valve. At this moment in our discussion on the heart, we turn our attention to cardiac muscle fibers. That is the individual cells that are doing the contraction. This first slide serves to observe some histology. So you might recall from 111, our first semester, that we studied skeletal muscle. Perhaps from this histology image, you can see how the skeletal muscle has parallel fibers and the cells are multinucleate. In contrast, on Looker's left is cardiac muscle, and we see that these cells are sort of interbranching, branching off and then branching back together. In addition, this cardiac muscle is uninucleate. It's going to have one nucleus. A special feature about cardiac muscle are these features called intercalated discs. Later on, we see how these are locations of communication between cells. And here we look at some microscopic anatomy of cardiac muscle. So that thick muscle wall of the myocardium in the heart is going to be composed of cardiac muscle cells. And like the skeletal muscle cells, they are striated, and they're also surrounded by endomysium. But compared to skeletal muscle cells, these cardiac muscle cells are going to be shorter, branched, and uninucleate. One interesting feature of the cardiac muscle cells is it does have T-tubules, but there is only one T-tubule per sarcomere, whereas you might recall that skeletal muscle has two T-tubules per sarcomere. In addition, on this diagram, you see that cardiac muscle has sarcoplasmic reticulum, but it's less extensive than that of skeletal muscle. And in addition, a cardiac muscle does indeed have the myofilament/myofibril anatomical arrangement like that of skeletal muscle. However, the optimal sarcomere length for contraction of cardiac muscle occurs in a more stretched state when blood is filling the chambers. These cardiac muscle cells must strongly anchor together and allow rapid transfer of action potentials from one cardiac muscle cell to another cells. And so the idea behind this is these cardiac muscle cells must all be in unison, so to speak. So we get what's called a functional synctium. The many cells that are in this heart must act as one. Something that makes this cardiac muscle unique is the stimulation. Surprisingly, some of these cells are self-excitable. They do not require a nervous system to innervate or to initiate depolarization. Again, then we can contrast that with skeletal muscle. Another unique feature about cardiac muscle is the organ versus motor unit contraction. In other words, the heart contracts as a single unit traveling as a wave across depolarization. You might recall in skeletal muscle, we're able to innervate just 1 or 2 motor units at a time. And then a unique feature about cardiac muscle is its length of refractory period. This long refractory period prevents tetanic contractions. So you might remember in skeletal muscle, we can get tetanus or tetany, whereas the muscle sort of locks up and it stays in a permanently excited tonic state. That would be bad for the heart to occur, so we have a nice long refractory period to prevent that. This diagram shows that refractory period. This refractory period shown in a kind of a dark blue in the middle. We are about ready to wrap up our discussion on the heart, and we might think about energy requirements for the heart. Now, I do not expect students to memorize this diagram shown on this page, but the main idea about this diagram is that the heart relies on aerobic respiration, and aerobic respiration is supplied by mitochondria. So we're going to have lots of mitochondria in this cardiac muscle. The heart will use whatever nutrient supply is available, even lactic acid. So in this diagram, notice that on the top portion we have proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. In other words, if you turned a food label around to the side, you would see that most food consists of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, lipids. Each one gets broken down in its own unique way. That's what's shown, all the activity in the middle. But notice at the very end, in the lower right-hand corner, we see the electron transport chain as the final step. There we have it, ATP. Adenosine triphosphate is our long-standing goal. Adenosine triphosphate is a sort of universal currency that all living organisms use to allow aerobic respiration to occur. Lastly, in case you would like to read a little bit more about human hearts, here are a couple links. I'm unsure if they still work, but give it a shot. And we can see that computer tomography is a way that we might view the heart. We might do a plastic inspection of a museum specimen. Here's where they're going to insert plastic sort of substances into all those vessels that we can study the heart in that way. And then another way we might view the human heart is for transplant. Well, that does conclude our first segment of the heart. We've got 2 more segments to go, parts 2 and 3. When we jump back into part 2, we will be looking at the conduction system, how an electrical current moves over the heart.